into the matter. To put it lightly, the intelligence community is rattled by more than the obvious here that a former president would choose to be so reckless with top secret information he was sworn to protect. His actions may have very well put the lives of Americans and American assets on the line.
As a CIA officer, our job is to recruit human assets overseas who are willing to turn their backs on their own countries to guarantee our safety here in America. And our job as CIA officers is to keep their identities secret and to keep their identities safe. And make no mystery about it, people either have died or will die as a result of these documents being placed out there.
Also new this weekend, a Trump-appointed judge in Florida signaling she's open to appointing what is called a special master to look into the case, move sought by Trump's legal team. Decision on a special master will be formally made in September. And over the next hour, a full breakdown on why Trump's requests could actually backfire. Here to help us make sense of all of this, Luke Broadwater. He's a congressional reporter for the New York Times, MSNBC contributor Melissa Murray, Frederick I. and Grace Stokes Professor of Law at NYU and faculty director of the Birnbaum Women's Leadership Network. Also with us, MSNBC political analyst Matthew Dowd, founder of Country Over Party. He served as chief strategist for the 2004 Bush-Cheney presidential campaign. Friends, it is good to see you all. Luke, I want to start with you. Talk us through your reporting about the potential threat from these Mar-a-Lago records. Why is the CIA so concerned?
Right. Well, so congressional committees on both the Senate side and the House side have asked for there to be this damage assessment conducted by the top intelligence officials in the United States government. And this was the first signal that the Intelligence Committee is in fact concerned about what was going on at Mar-a-Lago. Now, my understanding is the FBI, the Justice Department, will be investigating the part of the matter about who had access to these documents, and what the intelligence officials will be investigating is going through them all, determining which sources or methods can be identified and could have been compromised by their release. And I think it's very important to note that we were talking in some cases here about human sources, so real human beings who possibly could have been identified by these documents had they fallen into the wrong hands. And we know from the Justice Department that these were kept in a not secure area like they should have been, and there were many, many attempts over many, many months to try to get them back.
Melissa, what's the Director of National Intelligence, what do they do with the results of her investigation?
Well, a lot of the results here are simply going to be trying to assess what the consequences of any potential disclosure of this information, not necessarily that the information has been disclosed, right, but if it were to be disclosed, what would the impact of that be on national security? And so I imagine that whatever they learn from this assessment will be used to either shore up security around some of these human assets or to sequester the kinds of methods that they're using, maybe shift methods in certain cases, but basically to understand what could have been disclosed, what could have been known to foreign operatives, foreign enemies, and to make sure that our security going forward isn't compromised.
Matthew, some Republicans want to reveal even more about the highly sensitive materials at Mar-a-Lago. Take a listen.
Look, if you're going to take unprecedented action and raid a former president's house, well, you better have a strategy for unprecedented transparency. So I think we're all concerned about what might be in those documents. Some were classified, some weren't, you know, what the serious nature was. But show us. You got to be able to show your cards when you're taking actions like this.
Matt, I wonder how you think these demands for transparency are working out so far for Trump and his inner circle.
Well, the first thing I want to say is that the idea that they keep talking about the unprecedented actions of the Justice Department, the reason why they had unprecedented actions of the Justice Department was because of an unprecedented action of a former president and what he did with these documents and what he's ongoing done, putting the country at risk in so many different ways. I actually think this this seems to me the weakest part of their argument. They keep demanding transparency and what's going to happen, which has happened already. The more things are put out, the worse it is for President Trump. Now, maybe people like Chris Sununu and others have some sort of bank shot strategy that they think they can say this and then it'll hurt Trump more and Trump will disappear, because many Republicans know that the most dangerous thing that can happen in this election and the next election is Donald Trump to stand in the middle of it. So maybe they want to do this in order to weaken former President Trump's position in this. But the Republicans have no real response in this. The best response is to basically criticize the president, but far too many of them are too afraid of the former president to do that. And they're afraid of the former president because they're afraid of their own voters who will take it out on them.
I mean, Melissa, in addition to complaining about this purported lack of transparency, you also have conservatives complaining about the number of redactions in the unsealed affidavit. Your thoughts?
I mean, I wasn't surprised to see the number of redactions. It's typically the case when an affidavit like this is released. And again, it is quite unorthodox to release an affidavit like this in advance of any kind of criminal investigation. You have to have redactions. There's information that comes from the grand jury that has to be redacted here because the information contained in the affidavit detailed certain classified documents and also human operatives. It makes sense that they were likely to be redacted. Further, the witnesses that the FBI relied on to make out this affidavit of probable cause are likely sources that are close to the former president. And we've already discussed the prospect of possible witness tampering or retaliation or even threats against these witnesses. So it makes sense that all of this information was redacted. I wasn't surprised at all. I find it baffling that this is regarded as something that is not transparent given how much else we learned in the affidavit.
Yeah, absolutely. Luke, what did the affidavit reveal about the Justice Department's timeline here?
Right. Well, so, President Trump and some of his aides have been saying for a while, why didn't they just ask for the documents back? We would have given them to them. And what I think you saw here from this affidavit was more evidence. We've been reporting this, other outlets, about just what lengths the archives went to first and then the Justice Department went to second to try to get these very sensitive, top secret documents back. I mean, we're talking about about 20 months here. They tried to get these documents back, site visits, subpoenas, repeated requests, starting out pretty politely and collegial and then escalating over time until finally, from the Justice Department's own statements, they felt they had no choice but to go in and get these documents back because they knew they could risk the country's national security. And so, I think what we saw here, especially with that, and I want to mention again, the human sources that could have been at risk, according to this affidavit, I really feel like they felt like they had no other choice but to go in there and get them back via a search warrant.
No other choice. Melissa, how serious are the obstruction of justice charges the DOJ is weighing?
I think they're incredibly serious. One of the things that was perhaps most striking in the affidavit was that they detailed that there likely was evidence of obstruction that would be revealed, and that was part of the information that was redacted. So that suggests to me that there were sources close to the former president at Mar-a-Lago that was a source of that information to the FBI. And so, they don't have to offer everything in this affidavit for probable cause. The standard for probable cause is much lower than it is to actually convict someone of a crime. So it is likely this was just the bare minimum evidence they have of obstruction, and that if they were to mount a full-on prosecution, there would likely be even more evidence. So this, I think, is incredibly damning and revealing.
Okay, Matthew, even Trump's allies, they are raising the possibility of an indictment. Here is one of his former lawyers. Take a listen.
There is enough for an indictment, but there will not be an indictment and should not be an indictment based on what we've seen up to now. Once it's unredacted, maybe we'll have to change our minds.
Matthew, does the affidavit, do you think it marks a turning point for the former president, for those who have rallied around him?
Well, Alicia, I've identified, 22 turning points for this president among his base. And every time I think it's a turning point, his base is willing to just swallow more in the course of this. I mean, I think what this clearly demonstrates, and it's a convergence with the January 6th committee in the course of this, which is that we had a president of the United States who basically was not defending and protecting the Constitution of the United States and our democracy. We saw that throughout the January 6th and what he did and didn't do in response to that, how he helped instigate it. And now we see that he could care less about the classified nature of these documents and who it might put at risk, and even putting the national security of the country at risk. So there was a number of other times I thought, okay, this is going to change his base, that they're going to leave him. If national security and the worry of national security doesn't turn them, and it should have turned them already in the last 2 weeks, I don't know if this 30% of the country, which is basically a majority who vote in Republican primary, will ever be turned until Donald Trump fundamentally finally goes away.
22 times. Somehow I think we're going to see 23, 24. My friend Luke, thank you so much for being here. Matt and Melissa, you are sticking with me. Still to come this Sunday, we dig deeper into the other big headline facing Trump, his request for a special master for the Mar-a-Lago documents. Could his request put him in even more legal peril? Plus the midterms and 2 new studies giving insight into what likely will fuel voters to the polls this November. And later, DACA recipients left in limbo, the president working to protect dreamers. But as author and Morning Joe reporter Daniela Pierre-Bravo will explain, nothing but Congress can remove the deep fear caused by current law. For the first time in decades, Americans are not happy with the Supreme Court. Public opinion plummeting since Roe was overturned. Back in January of 2021, 44% of voters felt positively toward the court. Only 19% had a negative view. But our new survey, conducted in August, shows positive feelings about the court dropping by nearly 10 points. Negative feelings about the court jumping 23 points. Those numbers not exactly shocking, given the court's decision is so deeply misaligned with where most Americans stand on allowing safe access to abortion care. Because of stories like this one out of Louisiana, a woman named Nancy Davis is 10 weeks into her pregnancy. She learned her baby had a rare birth defect and would not survive its first week. But due to the state's murky abortion restrictions, Davis tells the Daily Beast she will seek care outside Louisiana in the coming days. She's lost faith that doctors in her home state can protect her.
I wouldn't want anybody to go through this, whether it's my kids, another woman who I don't know. No woman should have to endure this.
Nancy, far from alone, the Washington Post finds 1 in 3 women have lost access to nearly all elective abortions nationwide. Just this week, Idaho, Tennessee, and Texas enacted trigger laws banning nearly all abortions. So the question now, how do we restore these rights? Only Congress can, and that is if voters turn out in November to elect pro-choice candidates. New polling from Pew Research shows they might. 56% of voters say abortion is important in their midterm vote, and more than 60% of voters telling Pew that it really matters which party wins control of Congress this fall. With me now, Cristina Sinsun Ramirez, president of NextGen, and Aaron Huertas, communications director at Catalyst. Aaron, I got to ask you, before the ruling on Roe, you saw men outpacing women when it came to voter registration. Now, the New York Times shows an uptick. Women registering in these 10 states since the decision, they make up 55% of newly registered voters in those states. Aaron, I know you are not the data guy, you are the communications guy, but what are the voting trends you're noticing the closer and closer we get to midterms?
That data is totally consistent with what we see in the battleground states. So in a normal election year, the voter registration would run evenly between men and women. After the Dobbs decision, we see a spike in voter registration for women. And that happens in the battleground states because people have agency. They know that their vote is going to make a difference. They engage with the electoral system. They get registered. They get ready to vote. In Kansas, that spike was even bigger. That was 70% because they had an anti-abortion ballot initiative that they needed to strike down. The important thing, too, is we also looked at it and, are these Democratic women, are these Republican women? It's largely Democratic voters who are contributing to this surge, including Democratic women and Democratic men. So there is backlash here.
Yeah, Christina, Blake Masters, the Trump-backed Senate candidate in Arizona, recently scrubbed tough abortion restrictions from his website's policy page. Here is what Congressman Adam Kinzinger had to say about that. Take a listen.
Somehow in the Republican Party, the crueler you are, the more likely you are to win a primary. So Blake Masters, for instance, can erase his website all he wants and now pretend like he's some soft on this guy. Yeah. But he isn't, because he used it to win a primary.
I mean, Christina, I think that if there's something we know about voters, it's that they want to know what you stand for. They want you to be clear about that, and they want you to be consistent. So how is this going to land, this about face? How's it going to land with voters?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think voters are forgetting that Republicans are the ones that for years and years have been trying to outlaw and ban abortion. And now voters see just how extreme it is. You know, we help mobilize young voters, and similarly, we're seeing across states a surge in voter registration, especially of young Democratic women. And they are repulsed by what the Republican Party is trying to do to take away rights that they've experienced their whole lives. And I think Republicans should be scared, because 2 in 3 young voters have told us from the recent polling we did that they believe abortion is on the ballot this election. And from the New York Times to Harvard's youth voter poll, it's showing that we're expecting a youth voter turnout on par with what we saw in 2018, which helped deliver the House for Democrats and elect a slew of progressive candidates. Young people, women, it's very clear that they know which party is trying to outlaw and take our country backwards, trying to take away fundamental rights and freedoms, and that this is just the opening salvo, that they are coming not just for abortion, but they are coming for gay marriage and contraception.
Aaron, we saw Biden and his White House coming in hot this week on 2 fronts. You had the White House calling out Republican lawmakers who are criticizing President Biden's student loan relief plan, but who had their own PPP loans forgiven, and you had Biden accusing the GOP of semi-fascism and saying he cannot work with MAGA Republicans who embrace political violence. What do you make of this sort of shift in rhetorical strategy here?
It's a much sharper, more participatory way to communicate about the Democratic agenda. And that viral White House thread, 280,000 people retweeted that. It generated a lot of mainstream media coverage. So it's the sort of modern, aggressive messaging campaign that really takes it to Republicans, forces them to communicate on your turf and respond to you on the issues. And student debt relief is a winning issue for working families, for middle-class families. Republican counter-messaging has just been really pathetic and out of touch. All they have is like Ted Cruz makes fun of people who make coffee. They talk about people who get degrees in underwater basket weaving. I don't know anybody who's gotten a degree in underwater basket weaving. It doesn't resonate as much as the real world impact of these policies. And to the degree that this messaging provokes Republicans, it gets them to talk in our frame.
I'd also love to watch any of them survive, 10 minutes as a barista. Christina, more than 40 million Americans have student loan debt. Biden's plan was met with criticism by Republicans. I think that was expected. But we also saw Ohio Senator Tim Ryan distancing himself from the plan ahead of his reelection. I want to play some sound from him and Senator Bernie Sanders this morning on student loan relief. Take a listen.
There are a lot of people hurting in our society right now. People are getting crushed with inflation, crushed with gas prices, food prices, and all the rest. And I think a targeted approach right now really does send the wrong message. There's a lot of people out there making 30, 40 grand a year that didn't go to college, and they need help as well.
That criticism is correct, but the answer is not to deny help to people who cannot deal with these horrendous student debts. The answer is that maybe, just maybe, we want to have a government that works for all working people and not just the people on top.
To clarify, that was Representative Ryan, who is running for Senate. Christina, all the same, it is interesting that there are all of these policies, all of these tax codes that benefit the wealthy, and yet somehow this is the one policy that all of a sudden people want to talk about in the context of fairness that seems to be missing the forest through the trees.
I mean, the truth is, right, that student debt relief is overwhelmingly popular. The majority of Americans support student debt relief, and the majority of Americans also support making college accessible to every single American. I think Republicans are so angry, and they keep trying to say this is a giveaway. This isn't a giveaway. This is called democracy. Biden You run on ideas in a democracy to solve people's real life problems, and then they elect you to solve those problems and you enact those policies. That's what's happened here. So anybody that's whining about enacting policies that are overwhelmingly helping working and middle class Americans should actually start proposing ideas to solve people's pain, because there's an election just around the corner, and the young people that we represent are not going to elect candidates that have no plan and no big ideas. And this was one step forward to make college affordable for every single American. It's just a step, but it's a huge step, and it's a coalition that's overwhelmingly supportive of this action.
Christina, Aaron, thank you both so much. Next, a federal judge in Florida signaled this weekend's big story, former President Trump and the ongoing fallout from his hoarding of America's top secrets at Mar-a-Lago. Turns out Trump may actually get what he wants in court. Federal judge in Florida, who he appointed, signaling Saturday that she may appoint a special master for the Mar-a-Lago documents. Trump's legal team requested that independent legal review. A hearing is now set for Thursday. Judge Aileen Cannon is giving the DOJ until Wednesday to file its response to Trump's request for a special master. She's also asking the DOJ for a more detailed receipt of the records seized from Trump's resort. While it could delay the investigation into Trump, Democrats are fine with that. Here's why.
The special master is going to find the same thing that the Department of Justice found, which is that Donald Trump had hundreds of documents at Mar-a-Lago that were labeled confidential, secret, top secret, and then levels beyond top secret at the highest classification levels. That is a crime, if true.
Let's bring in MSNBC national security analyst Clint Watts. He is a former FBI special agent who's now a distinguished research fellow at the Foreign Policy Research Institute. Melissa and Nat are both back with us. Clint, the judge is asking for an update on the Justice Department's filter team. Can you talk us through who they are and the work that they do?
Yeah, so anytime documents are taken, particularly in a situation like this, you might have noticed in the back appendix of this affidavit, there was discussion of attorney-client privilege, meaning that they could come across documents that are attorney-client privilege. What they'll do is they'll assemble a team, they'll go document by document, they'll do an assessment, they'll triage and label it. Anything that is part of what is rightfully President Trump's doesn't pertain to the search warrant that may have been picked up during the search warrant, they'll return that. It's a pretty straightforward process. And I also think the issue with the special master that's come up, this is, I think, rather normal. I don't think it's out of procedure. Barb McQuaid was on, and, you know, as an attorney, she's got a better handle on the procedures for getting that. But I think that's a fairly normal process. What's more important over the last 3 days, from what I heard, is not really the filter team or the special master, but the damage assessment from the Intelligence Committee. I think that's where we're really going to see the biggest fallout probably over the longer term, and I think most concerning for the country as a whole.
Well, Clint, help me understand that, because it is a risk assessment, right? They're trying to assess what would happen if these document lands in his. Is that different than actually assessing the damage that was done? Is that a secondary component of this? How do you make that distinction?
I think it's probably both. They'll go through each of the individual documents. And what we don't know from the blacked out portions of that affidavit, if there was anything that tipped them off about how these documents were being used. Across all of this, what I don't know is why these documents were kept and why, when a couple tranches of documents went in, these were still kept at the house. What brought them to know that they had these documents? I think that could be part of that damage assessment, which is what were they being used for? How are they being used? I think in terms of the future, that's where the real damage will kick in, which is allies and partners. They would be very frightened, I think, to continue sharing intelligence in a lot of circumstances, because they would worry both about their sources and methods and whether the United States could protect them. And remember, here's the craziest part is President Trump might run for president again if he were to be elected. This would create even more damage. So I bet there's strong hesitation across the board about our partners in terms of sharing. It's more of a future risk. In terms of current risk, it's hard to know without seeing more of that affidavit or knowing what the documents are.
Melissa, I want you to weigh in on this question of how usual or unusual the request for a special master is, adding the element of their having waited 2 weeks to make this request, and the fact that the judge who has approved this request is a Trump appointee. Does that factor in?
So it is more common for special masters to be appointed in cases involving civil actions as opposed to criminal investigations, but it's not unprecedented in a situation like this one where there's a criminal investigation that involves the government recovery of disputed documents, that you would have a special master appointed to go through and review the documents for various legal privileges, whether it's attorney-client privilege or in this case, executive privilege. But as you say, Alicia, the fact that the request for the special master was made more than 2 weeks after these documents are recovered from Mar-a-Lago, I think speaks volumes. This was not top of mind. They submitted a quite shambolic, I believe is the legal term for it, initial filing before this court, and the judge was so baffled by it that she asked them to resubmit it. They seem to have done a better job of it the second time around, and she seems inclined to appoint a special master, although there will be a hearing on Thursday to go through all of the particulars, and she's asked the Department of Justice to also submit a filing in there with their response to all of this. But again, it's not unprecedented, but the timing of this is incredibly curious, especially since there's already a proceeding going on in the very same courthouse with Magistrate Judge Bruce Reinhardt, and this seems related, and typically matters of judicial economy and prudence, they might be consolidated under the same judge, but they made this particular request and got this Trump appointee, and that by itself, I think, is eyebrow raising.
Matt, Melissa calls it symbolic. I would call it a hot mess, and it's part of what we're seeing from this legal team, right, which is that they are in a bit of a scramble. I want to go back, though, to something that Clint was talking about, which was the possibility of risk of damage, not just to our national security in terms of the human assets that in some way may have been put into jeopardy, but also, the world is watching. They are watching as this all plays out. And so there's the question of America's role, the perception of America on the world stage, and how ultimately you recover from that.
I think that's a great question, because we're in the midst of this after the last 4 years of Donald Trump, where the world had lost total confidence in our ability to be the leading democracy in the world, and they still have questions about it. Leaders across the world and citizens across the world wonder what kind of democracy America is. Not only are we no longer the leading democracy, are we still one of the ranked democracies of the world? And when you have this kind of things, I mean, we have past experience of Donald Trump. This wasn't inadvertent. We know Donald Trump uses positions of power and uses things to further his own ends. A la, he tried to get the president of Ukraine to release dirt on Joe Biden, a political opponent, and withhold weapon systems to the president of Ukraine in the midst of this. And so we know Donald Trump's past. We know how he does this. He's not doing it to further the best interests of the country. And I think that's the problem. I mean, that's the problem with everybody overseas. And I'd hate to get to the point where the other countries start looking at us like a third world autocracy, that we don't have our house in order, that we're fundamentally a broken democracy, and we have these former leaders or current leaders when he existed as president of the United States who basically use all levels of power to either stay in power or to feather his own nest in this. And so that's the problem. And I know, in just looking at opinion polls, there is serious questions around the world about America and its position in the international community as a democracy.
Yeah. Clint, the New York Times reports the CIA issued a top secret memo last year about more informants getting killed worldwide. We cannot, of course, say that the uptick is linked to Trump's mishandling of classified info, but I do think we read that headline in light of what we are learning, and it helps put sort of the danger, what is on the line, in a bright light.
Yeah, there's just several scenarios. Let's just think about the actual assets, the human intelligence collectors that are out there. We saw the markings on the documents, in the affidavit, HCS. That's human intelligence. Imagine that information was known or had been, distributed even further. This was in an unclassified location with no supervision. We don't know who's seen those documents, and imagine those sources and methods are killed or captured somewhere around the world. I think separately, think of other scenarios where this would hit. Billions of dollars of taxpayer money are spent every year on the intelligence services to build signals intelligence and technical capabilities. SI, that's the other category that was in that affidavit. Those things, if they're discovered, foreign governments, terrorists, they just turn off their communication methods because they know now how they might be intercepted. And I think the other big one is you're a foreign country, you know something bad is going to happen to the United States, but you just can't trust that they're going to hold that information, keep it secret, maybe, you know, in the future harm your sources and methods so they don't share it all. And their world, our property, our personnel inside the government are harmed. Those are just, you know, 3 different variants. I could probably come up with hundreds of bad scenarios that can emerge from something like this.
Clint, Melissa, and Matt, thank you all so much for walking us through this. Next, rising food prices taking a toll. Kids are back in class across the country, but this fall semester not off to a great start for many campus kitchens, because districts are increasingly struggling to afford the very meals students need in order to thrive in class. In some cases, prices to make school lunch has jumped 80% since 2018. NBC's Priscilla Thompson explains why and how districts are working to overcome this hurdle.
At Churchill High School in San Antonio, Texas. Except with inflation rising and crippling staff shortages, this school year, those fresh fruits and vegetables, among other items, are on the chopping block.
Strawberries may have tripled in price, and so we are not able to offer the strawberries.
Everything is harder to find, School Nutrition Director Sharon Glosson says. When they do, it often costs more, and they may not have the staff to serve it.
We would generally have 7 serving lines open. We've gone down to 4 serving lines with only 2 menu choices daily.
They say improvise with what you have, you know, so and just make it look good and taste good, and they will take it.
School meals are often the healthiest students eat all day, a study shows. But as rising food costs are being felt in lunchrooms coast to coast, some districts are substituting frozen and processed foods for what was once fresh. Like Connie Daubels, Food and Nutrition Services Director for Davenport Community Schools in Iowa.
We can't get the taquitos, we can't get pancakes, we can't get French toast sticks, we can't get omelets, we can't get some of the beverages that we would like. And in our particular school district, we had to change bread providers, so we are not going to be able to have the same breads that we had last year.
The district is paying nearly double for bread this year, and the buns are smaller.
The students will notice that this year.
Back in San Antonio, those limited options and substitutions aren't going unnoticed either.
Yeah, strawberry milk, pink milk. They don't do that every day. You know, that used to be my favorite.
The quality has changed a little bit, and the proportions have been cut down a little smaller.
There's only 3 of like 7 lines that are open.
With the federal waiver that allowed all students to eat lunch for free during the pandemic gone and all the menu changes, parents like Genevieve Sigalski considering having her 2 students pack lunch this year.
We are already spending $280 a week on groceries. If the food changes to where it's not exactly what they want at school, we'll figure out a way for them to eat what they have at home.
A food fight like no other, with no end in sight. Priscilla Thompson, NBC News, San Antonio, Texas.
Our thanks to NBC's Priscilla Thompson for that report. Next.